Duke Nukem Forever was announced in 1997, released in 2011, and somehow still arrived feeling unfinished. In between came engine changes, lawsuits, missed deadlines, and a level of hype no game could safely carry. This was not a forgotten project nobody wanted. People waited, joked, argued, and kept believing for 14 years. By the time Duke finally returned, the punchline had become bigger than the game. Before Duke Nukem Forever became a cautionary tale, Duke Nukem was one of the strongest names in personal computer gaming. Duke Nukem 3D launched in 1996, and it hit at exactly the right moment. Doom had made the shooter fast and violent, but Duke made it loud, rude, and weirdly personal. Levels were not just corridors full of monsters. They were movie theaters, strip clubs, city streets, bathrooms, arcades, and alien-infested versions of places players recognized. The game also let you touch the world in a way that felt advanced at the time. You could smash glass, look in mirrors, flush toilets, tip dancers, blow holes in walls, and find jokes hidden in almost every corner. It made the environment part of the entertainment, not just scenery between fights. Then there was Duke himself. He was not a silent camera with a gun. He talked constantly, quoted action movies, insulted enemies, and carried the exact oversized attitude that defined a lot of 1990s pop culture. He was crude, shallow, and ridiculous, but that was the point. Duke was built to be recognized instantly, so when a sequel was announced, fans did not expect a normal follow-up. They expected the next leap for shooters. Duke had already turned technical flash, interactivity, and personality into a brand. That success created the trap. A sequel could not just be good. To justify the wait, it had to feel untouchable. In 1997, 3D Realms announced Duke Nukem Forever, and at that moment, it did not look like a disaster waiting to happen. It looked like the obvious next blockbuster. The early expectation was that the game would arrive quickly, while Duke was still fresh, loud, and commercially powerful. The studio had almost every advantage a developer could want. Duke Nukem 3D had sold millions, the fan base was hungry, and 3D Realms was not begging for attention or funding. They had money, confidence, and a character who already stood out in a crowded shooter market. A fast sequel could have turned Duke from a hit into a permanent franchise. The plan was not modest. Duke Nukem Forever was supposed to have bigger locations, sharper technology, more scripted chaos, and even more ways for players to interact with the world. 3D Realms wanted a shooter that made competitors look outdated, not just another campaign with better graphics. That ambition became the first real crack. The target kept moving because the idea of what Duke Nukem Forever should be kept expanding. Before the project was famous for missing release dates, it was already chasing a version of itself that the actual game could not keep up with. The decision that changed everything was not one dramatic cancellation. It was the habit of treating every new technological leap as a reason to rebuild. Duke Nukem Forever began with early internal work, then moved onto Quake 2 technology, which made sense at the time. Quake 2 was one of the strongest shooter engines available, and it gave the team a path toward a modern three-dimensional Duke game. For a while, the project looked like it had a real foundation. Then newer games started showing what was possible with Unreal technology. The lighting, environments, and visual presentation looked more advanced, and suddenly Duke Nukem Forever seemed behind before it was even close to release. Instead of finishing what they had, 3D Realms switched engines. That move was not a simple upgrade. It meant rebuilding major parts of the game, reworking tools, redesigning content, and dragging the schedule back into uncertainty. The team was not just changing the graphics layer, they were changing the ground the entire project stood on. This became the pattern. A rival shooter looked more cinematic, so Duke needed more spectacle. A new engine showed better visuals, so Duke had to look better. Another game raised expectations for physics, interaction, or scale, and Duke Nukem Forever tried to answer that too. The studio's famous attitude was, "When it is done," and without a hard deadline, that phrase became dangerous. It protected ambition from compromise, but it also removed the pressure to lock decisions and ship a real product. At some point, the team was no longer building the best version of a Duke sequel. They were chasing whatever the future looked like that year. What made Duke Nukem Forever unusual was that 3D Realms was not being crushed by the same immediate publisher pressure that defined many troubled game projects. The studio had made serious money from Duke Nukem 3D, and that success gave it leverage. It could fund much of the work itself, negotiate from a stronger position, and avoid the kind of strict external schedule that forces a team to cut features, freeze technology, and commit to release. At first, that freedom looked like the dream situation. The developers could experiment. They could reject weak ideas. They could wait until the game matched the image in their heads instead of shipping something unfinished because a financial quarter demanded it. But freedom without boundaries created a different problem. There was no final moment where the scope had to stop growing. There was no firm deadline that made every new idea compete against the need to finish. Perfectionism became easy to defend because every delay could be described as quality quality control, a better level, a better weapon, a better joke, a better system. Each individual choice could sound reasonable, but together they drained momentum from the project. The outside world noticed the change. Duke Nukem Forever was no longer just a long-awaited sequel. It became a running example of a game that could not land. The longer it stayed unfinished, the less people saw ambition, and the more they saw impossibility. By the early 2000s, Duke Nukem Forever had become bigger as a punchline than as a game. Every new screenshot or trailer arrived with a second conversation attached to it. Fans did not just ask what was in the game. They asked whether it was real, whether it would be rebuilt again, and whether anyone at 3D Realms still knew what the final version was supposed to be. The gaming press leaned into that reputation. Delay stories became easy headlines. Awards for vaporware turned the project into a yearly ritual of, public embarrassment. Even genuine progress had to pass through a filter of jokes, because the game had already trained people to expect another reset. That created a trap the developers could not simply work their way out of. Each year made expectations larger, because people imagined a game worthy of the wait. At the same time, many of the ideas that once seemed advanced were aging underneath them. Technology moved on. Shooter design moved on. Duke himself started to feel tied to a different era, so the project was fighting two clocks at once. One measured development time, the other measured cultural patience. By then, Duke Nukem Forever no longer had to be merely good. It had to justify the legend of its own delay, and that raised the question that would follow it all the way to release. After so many years, could any version possibly be enough? In 2009, the long delay finally became a financial crisis. 3D Realms had been funding much of Duke Nukem Forever itself, and after years of engine changes, staff turnover, and unfinished builds, the money was running out. In May, the studio laid off most of the internal development team working on the game. For the first time, Duke Nukem Forever was not just delayed, its core production had effectively stopped. That collapse quickly turned into a legal fight. Take-Two, the publisher that held the rights to release the game, sued 3D Realms for failing to deliver what had been promised for years. 3D Realms pushed back, arguing that development had not been permanently cancelled and that the company still owned the Duke Nukem property. The lawsuit made the situation public in a way trailers and rumors never had. Behind the jokes about vaporware was a real business dispute over money, contracts, and a game that still was not finished. In 2010, the two sides reached a settlement, clearing the way for someone else to step in. That someone was Gearbox Software. Gearbox acquired the Duke Nukem intellectual property and helped bring the remaining pieces of Duke Nukem Forever across the finish line. By then, the mission had changed. This was no longer about creating the biggest shooter anyone had ever seen. It was about ending the wait, shipping a playable version, and closing one of the longest development sagas in video game history. Duke Nukem Forever finally released in June of 2011 on personal computer, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. After roughly 14 years in development, the most famous unfinished game in the industry was suddenly a real product on store shelves. The problem was that it did not feel like a game from 2011. It felt like pieces of several older shooters stitched together across different eras. Some levels leaned on corridor gunfights and simple key hunting. Others paused for awkward physics puzzles, turret sections, driving segments, or crude minigames that interrupted the pace instead of building momentum. The humor had aged, even worse. Duke was built as a parody of action heroes from the 1990s, but by release, many of the jokes landed as leftovers from a culture the audience had already moved past. What once sounded outrageous now often sounded tired, and scenes meant to prove the game was edgy made it feel out of touch. Mechanically, it arrived after games like Halo, Call of Duty, and Half-Life 2 had changed what players expected from shooters. Duke Nukem Forever had limited weapon carrying, regenerating health, stiff encounters, and boss fights that rarely matched the legacy attached to the name. It was not only bad, it was trapped under impossible expectations, carrying design instincts from an older decade into a market that had moved on. And that is why its failure did not end the story. It gave Duke Nukem Forever a second life as a warning label. Duke Nukem Forever became more useful as a phrase than as a shooter. After release, its title turned into shorthand for any project that could not stop changing, could not stop restarting, and could not decide what finished actually meant. That is the strange legacy. The game no longer matters only because of what players installed in 2011. It matters because every long-delayed project now gets measured against it. When a studio changes engines too many times, expands the scope beyond control, or keeps chasing the next technological leap, Duke Nukem Forever is the name people reach for. Its history exposed a problem that goes beyond one developer. Technology will always improve during production. A better engine will appear. A new trend will dominate the market. Another competitor will raise the standard. If a project treats every change as a reason to rebuild, the finish line keeps moving, until the game becomes a museum of unfinished versions. That made Duke Nukem Forever unforgettable in the most ironic way possible. It wanted to return as proof that Duke still mattered. Instead, Instead, it became the mascot for development hell, and that leaves the real question: was Duke Nukem Forever doomed because it took too long to release, or because those delays created expectations no finished game could survive? Duke Nukem Forever was not killed by one bad choice. It was worn down by years of avoiding final choices. Maybe an earlier, messier version would have been remembered with more patience. Thanks for watching. Comment below, could Duke ever have launched successfully, or was failure already built in?